Okay, hello friends, and welcome to another exciting Members Habura Shiur. Today we have the privilege of having Rabbanit Halevy with us today in the first installment of her two-part series exploring contemporary social issues and perspectives offered by our Chachamim in response. About our speaker, Rabbanit Devorah is currently a PhD student and adjunct professor at Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. She also works as an associate clinical social worker at psychiatric centers at San Diego. She was raised in the illustrious Karlin-Stolen Hasidic community where her father, Rabbi Meir Goldberger, was the principal of the community's yeshiva. She underwent advanced studies at the Bet Yaakov Teacher Seminary, where she studied toward teacher certification, graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's in behavioral science from Mercy College, and with a master's of social work from the Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. Also, for those who missed it, we were honored to have an article by Rabbanit Levy in our most recent journal, which is available on our website. As usual, all our classes are recorded and available later on our website. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or message in the chat box. Please God, there will be time for questions at the end. With that said, thank you everyone for joining. Rabbanit, it is an honor to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Likewise, Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. Firstly, it's so nice to see so many familiar faces, so welcome back. It's so nice to see some unfamiliar faces, and then obviously some blank screens, so welcome to you also. Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much to Rabbi Dweck, who is Mala Berosh of this Habura, as well as to Sina and Avi, who tirelessly work on this. How do I know that? Because I live about 7 hours away from you. And if I'm getting messages at every single hour of the day, it must mean that Sina never goes to sleep. So I just want to give him a shout out and a chazak u'baruch and thank him. Though I've never met Sina's wife, I am positive that nothing great happens without her. So I want to give her a shout out too. And thank you. So chazak u'baruch. Last but not least, I want to thank my husband, who's on the screen, Chacham Yonatan Halevy, who is not just my husband, which obviously I have bias. I think he's phenomenal, but he's really my most inspirational teacher. And much of the Torah that I know, much of the Torah that I'm going to be sharing with you, is Torah that I've been privileged to not just learn together, but see in action. And I want to thank him. I also want to thank him, especially if you look at my source sheet. So all the sources are mine. That's a disclaimer. Not everything I say is something that he would necessarily say, but the formatting and really being able to make it look so beautiful is only thanks to him. It will probably take me another 10 years and a lot more technical skills to ever make things look this nice. So thank you so much. And a special shout out to my kids who are all sitting there and listening to the classes so that, God willing, one day they're going to be joining the Habura as well, both as teachers and students. They say there was a guy in a car. He's driving down the road. And as he's driving, he's going home. You know, the music's blasting and windows are open. And he looks out on the side of the road. He sees Hashem Yishmo. There are two guys just on their all four stuffing grass into their mouth. He says, I got to pull over. He pulls over to the side of the road. And he looks at it and he says, hey, guys, what are you doing? And they come and they're like scratched and scruffy. You can tell they haven't showered in days. And they look at him and they say, you know, sir, we're starving. We haven't eaten in days. We don't have meals. We don't have shelter. So we're eating the grass. He looks at it, he says, guys, get into my car. Why don't you come to my house? So one of the men looks and says, you know, that's so kind of you, but I have 3 kids who are over there eating some other grass. So he says, you know, bring them along. He said, I also have a wife. Okay, bring them along. He puts everybody into the back of his car. And he says, come to my house. They're driving, they get into the car, he turns the music down. And one of the men who was eating the grass looks at him and says, you know, thank you so much. This is so kind of you to take us in. So the driver looks at him and he says, yeah, of course, you know, in fact, I think you're going to love it because my front lawn has grass that's that much higher. You'll have so much more to eat. You know, today we're having a conversation about whose responsibility are the individuals of society that are vulnerable. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that people aren't eating grass on the side of the road, that people aren't dying in dumpsters because they have no shelter? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the vulnerable don't fall into the category, if you look at the title, survival of the fittest, right? We look at the animal kingdom and we know, you know, we have birds at home. So it's fascinating. When any of the birds are hurt, they immediately start getting very aggressive and they start showing a lot of power because they know that in the animal kingdom, it's really survival of the fittest. If you're not fit, you just won't make it tomorrow. You're not fit enough, you're somebody else's breakfast. And the question is, well, when it comes to human society, do we operate in the same way? Does it work that if you can make it to the top, no matter how, no matter what, so then you squash everybody you wrote and you make it up there? Or is it the responsibility of those who have more to take care of those who have less? And if yes, whose responsibility is it? Is it my responsibility when I see somebody on the side of the road who's begging for money to stop, give them $1, take them into my house? Is it the community's responsibility? Is it the government's responsibility? Or is it nobody's? And that's the conversation I want us to have today. Now, it's going to be a 3-part conversation. So the first one is historical context, okay? How we look at those who are in need. How we look at those who we would put into the category of vulnerable. That's our first historical context. And what does it look like to have what we know as a welfare state, which welfare is really the general well-being of people. Welfare state is normally referring to the government's direct involvement in taking care of the vulnerable population. So we have, our first conversation is historical context. The second half is 2 parts, which is a fascinating teshuvah from Rabbi Chaim David Levy on exactly this, government's responsibility or lack of responsibility in social welfare. And that'll be 2 parts, one involving Tanakh and then the teshuvah. So let me walk you through a little bit of history. Disclaimer, none of this is meant to be political. So I don't care if you're on the far right or the far left or the far middle. This is a conversation about society. Right? We're not talking about who you did vote for, who you didn't vote for. I certainly don't get involved in my politics here in the United States, and I'm definitely not going to get involved in yours. But I want to talk about a little bit of history. So you have, we have the medieval era, 500 to 1500, where most of Europe, at least the Western side, is living under feudalism, which is a very rigid system. We have the 1500s, 1600s, specifically in England. The 1600s is the late 1500s, leading into the 1600s, pretty tough. We have famine, a huge economic depression. And the government realizes very quickly that with the feudal system falling, there's a lot more chaos. The system of where there's a king and a noble and the serfs and the manors and the powerful Catholic Church is falling apart. And the people most vulnerable are falling through the cracks. So the widows, the orphans, the women, the incompetent. And this is where you have the creation of what's known as the Elizabethan laws or the poor laws. By show of hands, anybody know what the poor laws of 1601 was? Okay, awesome. It always makes me sad when I ask people, like, do you know this chacham, that chacham? And then when I ask them like regular, general stuff, I realize it's not that they're ignorant in Judaism, we're just all ignorant, period. So that makes me at least happy that it's unanimous. The Elizabethan laws, as you can guess, was started by Queen Elizabeth I, which was really targeted at, and this is a major step, at figuring out what is government's involvement in taking care of the needy. And I want you to look at page number 1. This is a subsection, okay? The laws are much longer, but I want you to look at a little section of the Elizabethan laws. So if you look at page 1 on the second column, the first column talks about the parishes and the different division of who's going to take care of what, who's going to collect funds. But if you look at the second paragraph at the bolded, it says, for setting to work of the children whose parents shall not by the say church wardens and overseers, or the greater part of them, be brought able to keep and maintain their children. So here, this is, again, there are children who, for whatever reason, through poverty, illness, today we would say drug abuse, and other forms of inability for parents to take care of children, this act is meant to take care of those children. And also for setting to work all such persons, married or unmarried, having no means to maintain them, or no ordinary and daily trade of life to get their living by. So here you have able-bodied people, but no employment. You have people who, they're physically capable of going out to work, but there's nothing for them to work at. So we're going to now try to get them into the workforce. And also to raise weekly or otherwise, go to the next bolded, a convenient stock of flax, hemp, wool, thread, iron, and other necessary wear and stuff to set the poor on work. So we see huge unemployment over here, right? We're just coming off years of famine, economic depression. There are thousands of people that are unemployed. So in addition to taking care of the here and now, we need clothing, shelter, food. Let's get people back on their feet so they don't need to stay forever dependent. The necessary relief of the lame, the impotent. What does the impotent mean? So this is where you have something fascinating. The Elizabethan laws in essence creates what we consider the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Tell me who would be in the category of deserving poor. Who would you say, these are people that are deserving? Give me an example.
The disabled.
Okay, the disabled. Somebody who you look at them, yeah, they're missing an arm and a leg, chas v'shalom. And this was especially common, we're talking about when there was no regulation of factories, right? In the 1750s, people were all the time losing major limbs. So here we have somebody who's disabled. It's obvious to us that they need our help. So that's somebody who we say that they deserve to, not that they deserve to be poor, but they deserve our compassion and kindness. Give me another example of somebody who would be a deserving poor. Children.
Orphan.
Sorry?
Yeah, an orphan.
An orphan.
Children, yeah.
Very good. An orphan, right? An orphan. Somebody who doesn't have their parents to care for them. Lo aleinu. Right? How is a 7-year-old supposed to take care of themselves? I don't know. I meet 45-year-olds who still haven't gotten their act together. How in the world can we have somebody that young take care of themselves? So the orphans, again, we would put into the deserving category. Women, children, people suffering from physical disabilities. Right? These are people we understand why circumstances made them poor, and therefore we have compassion towards them. Talk to me about the undeserving poor. Who do we look at and say, no, you don't deserve to be poor, and therefore you don't deserve my help? Who would you put in that category?
Mental ill. People that are sick.
Mental health, right? People, it's fascinating how many organizations there are to take care of people with physical illnesses, right? Somebody has cancer, they're going to fly them across the world to Disneyland to take them on trips. Physical illness is, because we see it, we understand it. So we have a tremendous amount of compassion. When it comes to mental health issues, it's just in your head. Just be happy. Right? How many people, imagine you told somebody diabetic, you don't need to take insulin, just think good thoughts. That would never make sense to us. Right? You tell somebody, don't do chemo anymore. I promise you, if you meditate every single day, you will be cured. Right? Why don't you take a few pills for anxiety? If we would treat physical illness like we treat mental illness, the world would be a disaster. But yes, mental illness, right? They don't deserve. Get up, go out, work. The undeserving is a population that we've decided you're capable. You're able to work. I want you to look at page 2. You'll notice there's a quote from a book written by somebody, Walter, labeled From Poor Law to Welfare State. He's actually a Jewish individual from Brooklyn who I believe moved out to somewhere in the Midwest and has exclusively been studying welfare states. So if you look at the first bolded, the Elizabethan Poor Law, right? So this is source 2. Embodied the conflicting strain between the desire to reinforce the feudal structure and the increasing assumption by civil government of responsibility for the downtrodden. So you have this tug of war of, can we go back to the old model where everybody kind of does their own thing? Do we need the government involved? I want you to look at the second quote. More important, vagrants refusing work could be committed to a house of correction. So here we have the division. The deserving we will take care of. We'll give you clothing, shelter, housing. We'll set up organizations for you. But if you, dear to be from the group we decided doesn't deserve our compassion, you could be committed to a house of correction where they whipped, branded, or put in pillories and stoned, or even put to death. And the measure did not provide for the right of appeal by the recipients or potential recipients of relief if they felt aggrieved. So if society judged you, you came to the office and said, hey, I don't have work, I don't have food, I don't have shelter, and the government looked at you, or the people in charge looked and said, you look capable to me. I don't understand why you can't work. I don't understand why you can't take care of yourself. It's because of your misdeeds. And therefore, we have the right not just to judge you, but to make sure that you don't get any help. And that's where we have the poor laws creating almost this division of we get to decide who deserves, and based on what we've decided, we will then either give or not. Now this all changes. Okay, so we have years, hundreds of years, where the poor laws not just start in England, but they transfer over to America with the early colonists. So that is the way the American society is set up in the beginning, where those who we believe need will get. Those who we believe don't need, we will not just not give, we will persecute. I always wonder, if you don't want to give the homeless person $1, why do you have to spit at him? Right? You've decided that he doesn't deserve to get, so why do you kick him on the side of the road? Right? So what happens? I want to take you to 1929. Talk to me about what happens on October 29th, 1929 in the United States.
Stock market crashes.
Yeah. So October 29th is known as Black Tuesday, okay? One of the darkest days, not just in American history, but really in the world because it's a domino. So you have years and years of corruption, right? Something known as the Gilded Age. It looked beautiful, but the inside was trash. Things were crumbling. People were buying on credit. Comes October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes. Now, if you ever look at pictures of the day the stock market crashed, the only other image that I recall that looks similar to that is 9/11, and I'll explain to you what I mean. When I was very young, I was in 8th grade when 9/11 struck. And I remember watching the footage. So we didn't grow up with TV, but we went down the block to my old neighbor who was allowed to have a TV, and we sat glued. And I remember looking at the buildings as they were crashing and seeing things that didn't quite look like debris. And then when you look at the footage again, it doesn't look like debris because it's not debris. It was human beings who felt that their end was near, which they were correct, and they were jumping out of the buildings. You look at images of the 1929 stock market crash, you have people who had millions invested become penniless, not overnight, within hours. And you see people jumping out of the buildings on Wall Street, jumping out in. What you have here is something fascinating. Within a day, suddenly, the definition of poor changes completely. The judgment of, well, it's because of your bad choices that you're poor. It's because of your own lack of initiative. That's why you don't have money. It's because you don't take enough time to invest in yourself. Suddenly you have the rich becoming the poor. And the conversation around poverty changes completely. The conversation not just around poverty, but also government assistance. And I want you to look at the third source, the bottom quote that's bolded. As one observer aptly remarked, trying to turn back this tide of distress through private philanthropic contributions is about as useless as trying to put out a fire hose with a garden hose, okay? The world is burning down. We have millions of people who are not just unemployed, but are poverty struck. They cannot pay their bills. They don't have where to live tomorrow. They don't have a roof over their head. For many, then, the Depression answered once and for all the vexing question of whether private or public agencies should be responsible for relief giving. Meaning, whose responsibility is this? How many individual organizations can we set up to help a nationwide depression? Voluntary charity simply could not cope with the situation. Only public agencies could deal with the collapse of the economy, mass unemployment, and widespread destitution. You have over here literally the collapse of the economy and the entire social structure. And we know that in the United States, you have FDR, Roosevelt, who then brings in the 100-day deals, where he starts enacting many government policies, in essence starting what we know today in the United States as the welfare state. In England, though the Elizabethan laws are the ones that start the welfare state, it's after World War II where the government really shifts. And I want you to look at the cartoon that you have on the first page, which this was the plan that was put forth by, I believe he's Baron. Okay, I don't know the difference between Baron and Sir, but I believe he's Baron Beveridge. Does that name ring a bell at all? Maybe? Yeah, okay. So we know that during World War II, World War I and then World War II, subsequently, so you have World War I, 1914 to 1918, the Great Depression starting in the United States and then transferring all across Europe, where again, people are destitute. There's a famous picture of a woman in Germany who's going to buy a loaf of bread. And she has a barrel that is overflowing with francs because the inflation was so high that there was no use to the money. Europe falls into the Depression, comes World War II, and the government really takes over a lot of not just the economic, political, but social elements. And you have Beveridge at the end in the 1940s, I believe 1945, proposing this plan to deal with what he dubbed the 5 giant evils. And if you look at the cartoon, you have what he calls the 5 areas that a government has to take care of every single citizen, specifically the vulnerable. So you have on the left, number 1 is idleness, which would translate to unemployment. Simply, people do not have jobs. You have capable human beings who want to work, but they don't have where to work. You have the flip side, which is people who want to work, but they don't have the ability, whether it's because they lack education, they lack resources to get to and from work, The next one is you have want. So want is needs, right? Not, I want this, I want a new iPhone, I want a new computer. I want, meaning I want to be able to give my child a piece of bread to eat. I want to be able to have a roof over my head. I want to be able to know that tomorrow I'm going to be able to survive, and the next day and the next day. And that's really dealing with poverty. The third one is disease. I don't think we need to explain what disease is. We've been living a year and a half with a global pandemic. But dealing with disease, things that are really out of our control, but directly impact a person's ability to live. 4 is ignorance, which is lack of education. Right? It's really easy for the person who is able to go to elementary, high school, pre-college, master's, PhD, continue moving up the food chain, say, I wonder why people aren't educated. I can explain to you why some people aren't educated. When they can't figure out where they're going to sleep tomorrow, or if they will be able to make ends meet and feed themselves, so there's no real ability to then move up in the realm of education. The problem we know is, with education, poverty decreases, right? So there are two sides of the coin that really need each other, but the lack of education. And the fourth one is squalor. What does squalor mean? So squalor means, yeah, go ahead, Margaret.
Squalor is to live in abject dirt.
Yeah.
With no running water, rats running around, that is squalor.
Yeah.
Uncleanliness, which breeds disease.
So that's exactly the definition. Squalor is, you have in the 1750s, with the rise of industrialization, huge factories, people want to move to cities. Very quickly, you have the beautiful streets with manicured lawns and, you know, the beautiful flowers, and their windows are perfectly clean, matching to their little furniture that they have in the front. And then move a few blocks later and you have what we know as slums, where they're rat infested, disease infested, violence, right? And here we have, I know for example, in New York, they used to have what's called the tenement houses. They still have in the Lower East Side a museum where you walk in and you wonder how did this pass inspection? I mean, every third step is missing. There's no banister on the side. Forget about running water. We're talking about families averaging 7-8 kids living in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. There are no bathrooms, despite bathrooms having been invented. Conditions that are really unlivable. And this beverage says if the government would take hold of these 5 pillars and make it their responsibility, society at large would be taken care of. So that's the perspective of what a welfare state looks like. And it ebbs and flows, again, depending on the politics, depending on the government. But I want to talk to you, what's the Jewish philosophy on welfare? Is it every man on its own? Is it survival of the fittest? Is it fully the government's responsibility? Are we just really a bunch of socialists? Was Karl Marx right? How does that work? So I want to talk to you about Rabbi Chaim David Halevy's Teshuvah, but before we could talk about it, we have to learn some Tanakh. So if you look at page 3 with me, now I have to tell you, before you learn anything, you have to learn Tanakh. So much of what the Jewish community today deals with is because of the absolute ignorance, and I believe it's willful ignorance. I believe it's malicious ignorance not to tap into our past. When you learn the words of the Navi, you very quickly realize that what everybody claims to be as the standard Orthodox Judaism that has been passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu, I don't know about you, but I haven't found it yet in the Navi. When you talk about David HaMelech going out to war, Shaul HaMelech and his ups and downs in life, the Navi Yeshayahu screaming at the people, stop being so religious, I believe it's a willful ignorance, but really, for us to be able to understand the world from the context of our Chachamim, you have to learn Tanakh. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Givonim. By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the story, who the Givonim are, the story of the Givonim? Yes? Okay, we have one. Okay, so the Jewish people, we're on page 3, source 1. The Jewish people come to the land of Israel, and Yehoshua is tasked with Kibush v'chiluk haaretz, conquering and then splitting the land between the tribes. Now Yehoshua, before he comes into the land, sends 3 different messages to the 7 nations. The first one, you're more than welcome to leave. Relocate, right? we're not coming to war. If you would like, we're coming to take over the country. But you're more than welcome to leave. The second one is, you don't want to leave? That's fine. But you will then have to become not naturalized citizens, but you will have to be under our jurisdiction. So you will have to pledge allegiance to us, you will have to pay taxes, tributes, and be a part of the functional society. You cannot be a nation in our nation. That doesn't work. The third option was war. So what happens is Yoshua comes, and here we have the Givonim. So I want to read, if you look at Pasuk Gimel. V'yoshvei Givon, and the residents of Givon, shamu et asher asa Yoshua liYericho v'la'ai. So they heard about already how Yoshua had conquered the city of Yericho and turned it into absolute rubble, and how they conquered the city of Ai. Vayasu gam hema ba'oma. So they figured, hold on, we're next. So they come with trickery. Vayelchu vayitztayeru vayikhu sakim balim lechamorehem v'noadot yayin balim uvkaim nutzorim. So the Givonim say, hold on, we're next. So they decide to trick Yoshua. They got themselves all dressed up into clothing that was dirty, rugged. They took their wineskins and made them look all messed up from a long journey. They brought their bread and they hardened it and made it all crumbling. And they come to Yehoshua and they say, you know, we come from a very far off country, from a totally different land. And we've been traveling because we want to come and we want to seek refuge amongst you guys. And at first Yehoshua says, are you sure you're not residents from here? And they say, look at us. We're disheveled, we're dirty. It's clear from just our presentation that we come from a very far place. So Yehoshua says, look, if you're coming to seek asylum, come. And what he does is he makes a shivua. He makes a contract with them. He promises them, if you look down at Pasuk Tet Vav, Vayas lahem Yehoshua shalom. He said, you know what? I will make peace with you. Because my obligation is to clean the land of the residents that are currently here. But if you're coming from somewhere else and you want to settle, no problems. He makes a peace agreement with them. Vayichos lahem brit l'chayotam. He promises l'chayotam, to give them the ability to live there peacefully, to sustain them. Vayishbou lahem nesiei eda, and the Nesiim also swear to keep them safe. A couple of days later, as they're traveling into Israel, they chance upon the cities of the Givonim, and they realize, hold on, we've been tricked. The Givonim have their houses, they have their communities, the buildings, everything's set up. And Yoshua feels tricked. So he comes and look at Pasuk Yutet. Vayomru kol hanesim el kol ha'eda. Anachnu nishbanu lahem. We've promised them, we've sworn to them. B'Adonai Elohei Yisrael v'ata lo nuchal lingoa b'hem. Because we've sworn to them that we will not cause war, we will not kill them out, despite their trickery, we can't break our promise. Zot na'aseh, I'm reading on the top left of page 3. Zot na'aseh lehem v'hachayeh otam. We promised them that we would sustain them. So truthfully, they should be killed. But because we've made a promise, even though the promise was made under false assumptions, we have to upkeep that. Hold that thought in mind for a little bit later. Vayomru aleim hanesim. So the Nesiim tell them, yichyu, they should live. V'yuchot ve'etzim, and they're going to be the wood choppers. V'shoavei mayim l'chol ha'eda kasher dibru lahem Nesiim. There's nothing we can do. We signed a false contract, but we are unable to retract, and therefore we will promise to protect the Givonim, and not just protect them, but allow them to be the wood choppers and the water carriers. Now, if you look at Pasuk Chav Gimel, Vata arurim atem, you are cursed. Yoshua said, you are cursed. You tricked us. You've done something that was highly incorrect and abominable. Atem v'lo yikares mikem eved v'chotvei etzim v'shoavei mayim lebet Eleh. He says, though you won't be able to join the Jewish people, you will be allowed to be the wood choppers, the water carriers, specifically for the house of Hashem. Look at Pasuk Chavav. Vayas lahem ken, and that's what he did to them. Vayatzel otam, he saved them. Miad bnei Yisrael v'lo haragum, and they were not killed. The Jewish people were extremely upset, and they would have forged ahead and gone to war had Yoshua not told them, look, you cannot break your promise, we can't kill them. ויתנם יהושע ביום ההוא חוטבי עצים ושואבי מים לעדה ולמזבח אדוני עד היום הזה אל המקום אשיב יבך. And he gave them the job of being the wood choppers and the water carriers. So here you have a fascinating story where a group of individuals, through trickery, through lies, people who we certainly say you don't deserve anything, right? If anybody was undeserving, it's the people who lie. And yet Yoshua says, I'm going to honor our contract and we will make you the wood choppers and the water carriers in our community. Now let's fast forward to another story. So we have Shaul HaMelech constantly on the chase of David. Why is Shaul chasing David HaMelech? What happens that Shaul wants to kill David?
Elchanan has an answer for
I
you.
think he's going to be the next king.
You are absolutely correct. Elchanan, that was such a beautiful answer. You know that Elchanan, Avinoam, and the girls, Shira and Hodaya, they learn Navi every single night, so they know this, right? So what happens? David HaMelech is seeking refuge. He just got word from Yonatan, who is his best friend, telling him, you're correct. Your assumption that my father, Shaul HaMelech, wants to kill you is accurate. Run for your life and go hide. So he runs off to the city of Nov. What is unique about the city of Nov? Who lives in the city of Nov?
The Kohanim.
Very good. Nov is the city of the Kohanim, right? Nov ira Kohanim. Look at source 2 on page 3. On pasuk bet. Vayavo David Nova. So David comes to the city of Nov. El Achimelech HaKohen. Achimelech at that point is the Kohen. Again, there's no Bet HaMikdash at this point, but there is a house of Hashem. We know there was a Mishkan, correct? So what happens? Vayacharad Achimelech likrat David. Vayomer lo madua ata levadcha v'ish en itcha. And he's worried. Achimelech sees David and he says, why are you here alone? And David doesn't divulge it's because Shaul's going to kill me. David, throughout the story, has tremendous kavod, tremendous respect to the person who actually just wants to murder him. And he tells him, I'm here on a secret mission. Do you have any food? Anything I could eat? And Achimelech says, no, I have nothing to eat except for the lechem hapanim, which is reserved for the Kohanim. David says, give them to me. He gives him 5 loaves of bread and then David says, do you have any kind of weaponry? And Achimelech says, yes, I actually have the sword of Goliath that you, David HaMelech, slayed. I have his sword. He pulls out his sword, he gives it to David, and he sends him on his way. The problem is there's always one bad apple. Look at Pasuk Daled. Let's look at actually Pasuk Chet. Visham, and over there in this whole exchange, in the city of the Kohanim, Achimelech is talking to David, giving him what he needs. In this whole story, Visham ish me'avdei Shaul. There's one person who's also a servant of Shaul HaMelech. Bayom ha'u ne'etzar lifnei Adonai u'shmo Doeg HaDomi. Abir haroim asher l'Shaul. So there's one man, his name is Doeg HaDomi. He is either the head of the herdsmen or he's the head of the people, because it doesn't say Roe Tzon, he says the head. And he sees this whole exchange. And what does he do? He goes back to Shaul. He says, hey, Shaul, do you know where David is? Shaul says, no, I'm actually searching for him. He says, well, let me tell you. I just came from the city of the Kohanim. I was learning their Torah with them. Guess who I saw? Not only did I see David HaMelech, but I also saw him buddy-buddy with Achimelech, the Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen. He was giving him food. He was giving him weaponry. So Shaul calls Achimelech. He says, is it true? Is it true that you're harboring my enemy? Here is somebody, David HaMelech, who is committing treason against me. He's trying to harm me. He's trying to take away the rightful kingship from my family. Now, we know obviously that perception is incorrect. David HaMelech at this point was already crowned to be the next king. And that's what Achimelech responds. He says, but what do you mean? This is David Avdi. This is David, your faithful servant. And Shaul says, you and your entire city of Kohanim deserve to be put to death because you're on the side of those who are committing treason. And he calls them and he has Doeg HaDomi kill out the entire city of Kohanim. Let's look at page 4. If you look down at source 3, Pasuk Yud Zayin. So it's on the second column. Vayomer HaMelech l'ratzim hanitzavim elav. So Shaul tells the people who are around him, Sobu v'amitu kohanei Adonai. Go, turn around and go kill the Kohanim. Ki gam yadam im David. Because they're also on David's team. They have a hand in helping David escape me. V'chi yadu ki boreachu v'lo galu et ozni. They knew he's running away from me. They know I'm chasing him and they didn't even bother. They didn't have the audacity to come and share with me. Vayomer HaMelech LeDoeg, so he tells Doeg Adomi, go, turn around, go and kill the city. And they go and they massacre the entire city. Now, if you'll recall correctly, Yoshua had promised the Givonim that they would be the wood choppers and the water carriers in Bet Adonai. What is Bet Adonai? Where would they be the wood choppers and water carriers? Where is Bet Adonai?
The Givonim.
Oh. The Givonim are promised, you will be the wood choppers, the water carriers for those who serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, meaning they will be the ones serving the city of Kohanim. So now suddenly you have the entire city of Kohanim is massacred. What happens to the Givonim? If the entire city is massacred, what do they clearly not need from the Givonim?
They don't have a job, so they don't have a job.
Kol hakavod Elchanan. Next time you're coming to give the class with me. Yeah. They don't have jobs. They are unemployed. Their entire operation has just been shut down completely. If there's no city of Kohanim, there's nobody to bring water to. There's nobody to bring wood chopping to, right? There's no need. And ultimately we have the Givonim are completely unemployed. Let's jump forward to Shmuel Bet. So Shaul HaMelech died. Yehonatan died. The war is over. The years and years of persecution are just about behind as far as Shaul. Though David HaMelech, his life is a never-ending persecution. So David HaMelech is experiencing 3 years of famine. And when he tries to figure out, well, why? What are the Jewish people doing? The first year he says maybe it's because of Avodah Zarah. So during Hakel, he gives the community rebuke and they say, we're not of the Avodah Zarah. It's not idol worship. The next year he says maybe it's Gilu Arayot. Maybe it's because of sexual immorality. Nope. Maybe it's Shvichat Damim. And that's when he says, oh, you want to talk about Shvichat Damim? You want to talk about murder? Why is the Jewish community suffering from hunger? So let's look at source 4. Pasuk Aleph. So this is in Shmuel Bet. Vayi Rav b'imei David, and there was a hunger, a famine in the days of David. Shalosh shanim shana, 3 years. Achrei shana, right? 3 years consecutively. Vayivakesh David et pnei Adonai, and he asks, right? Vayomer Adonai, and Hashem says to him, do you want to know why I brought famine to the land? Do you want to know why people are starving to death? Vayomer Adonai el Shaul ve'el bet hadamim al asher hemit et hagivonim. The reason you're suffering from hunger is because of the actions of Shaul and his family and the murderous acts that they've committed towards the Givonim. So what happens? David calls the Givonim and he says, we're suffering. We're suffering because of you and because of the actions we've done towards you. What can we do to appease you? And you should know the Givonim in their cruelty, what do they ask for? What is their appeasement? What do they want?
They want the sons of the king.
They say, you kill, what are we going to get? Gold, silver? Shaul HaMelech didn't rob us. He didn't come take our gold and silver, but he massacred us. Give us some of his people. Yeah. Very different Middle Eastern mentality of dealing with problems. Different conversation for a different time of when you live in the Middle East and you try to act like European colonists, how that works out. But I've once watched a fascinating documentary on what a salcha is, where when 2 tribes in the Middle East fight and one of them massacres, so part of bringing peace is the other tribe has to bring members of their tribe and let the tribe that was hurt massacre them. And only once blood is shed, that's when peace comes again. You have over here, the Givonim say, give us 7 of yours. Give us 7 of Shaul's children, 7 of Shaul's ancestry. We will murder them. Hang them up for everybody to see, and that will appease us. So if you look at Pasuk Daled, Vayomeru lo ha-Givonim, the Givonim say, En lanu kesef zav v'im Shaul. Gold and silver, that's not what he took from us. V'im beto ve'en lo ish la'amid b'Yisrael. Vayomer, ma atem omrim me'aseh lechem. What should we do? Vayomeru el HaMelech. So they say to David, Ha'ish asher kilanu, the person who's decimated us, v'asher dima lanu, nishmadnu mityatzeh b'chol gvul Yisrael. Give us his children, and we will kill him. What does David HaMelech do? He does. He chooses 7 of the children, sparing Mephibosheth, the son of Yehonatan, and they hang them. The Givonim they kill them, and they hang them up in the city, and they leave them there, the bodies, to just hang for everybody to see. Don't mess with us. Vayitnem, if you look at the page 5, Pasuk Tet, Vayitnem biyad hagivonim, he gives over the 7 ancestors, the 7 descendants of Shaul. Vayitnem biyad hagivonim, vayokium bahar lefnei Adonai, vayiplu shevatam yachad vehema umotu bimei katzir b'shonim b'tchilat katzir sorim. And it's during the harvest season where everybody's out and everybody sees, and they ultimately murder the 7 members of Shaul's family, and that is when the famine stops. Now this is the historical background for the conversation we now need to have about welfare, about caring for the vulnerable, about caring not just for the vulnerable, but the problematic individuals in society, for the people who have not just wronged us, but we really deemed not undeserving, unwanted, hated. What do we do with them? I want to walk you through a teshuvah of Rabbi Chaim David Levy. By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the writings of Rabbi Chaim David Levy? Okay. Be'ezrat Hashem, by the time we're done, my hope is that you will fall in love with him like I have. There's a book written by Rabbi Dr. Mark Angel and his son Rabbi Chaim Angel, which is titled Rabbi Chaim David Levy, Gentle Scholar and Courageous Thinker. And I'm going to show you a picture if you can see. I don't know if you can see, but that is the picture of Chacham David Levy, where he's a gentle scholar, but he's a courageous thinker. I want to share with you just a little bit of who he was. I believe Rabbi Chaim David Levy was a Yerushalmi who grew up in the city, in the neighborhood which today is Nachlaot, but the Ohel Moshe neighborhood in the Toronto Shul. The Toronto Bet Knesset was actually donated by Sir Moses Montefiore, as was much of Yerushalayim and Israel. Yet somehow the narrative of the Sephardim never built the state of Israel is one that is with much fascination, right? So you have here Chacham David Levy. They say when he was very, very young, he used to love to sit around in the Bet Knesset with the elder Chachamim and learn, and he loved to learn Zohar with his father. Harab Ben Zion, and I don't know how to pronounce it, I think it's Swenka, was Av Bedin, and he saw Chacham David Levy's diligence and intelligence, and he told his parents, listen, the other kids you want to send to the French schools that are teaching all different stuff, that's fine. This one you have to send to Porat Yosef. You have to send him somewhere that he's going to grow into a Torah scholar. And the parents do. His parents, Mr. I believe, Moshe and Victoria Levy, send him to Porat Yosef. And we're talking about a class, I mean, this is like the dream team class with Chacham Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, Harav Shlush. It's an unbelievably powerful class. He learns under the tutelage of, I believe, Chacham Ezra Atiyah, but is more closely connected to Harav Uziel. Rav Uziel's philosophy, lifestyle. Ultimately, Harav Uziel brings him on as his personal secretary during the years that Chacham Uziel is the Rishon LeZion. For a short while, he also taught in Chacham Uziel's school that was run by the Tzitz Eliezer, Harav Eliezer Waldenberg. And the common theme is you find that Rabbi Chaim David Levy is not a fighter. He loves the people. He wants to make change for the people. He was extremely active in making sure in the 1950s. So there was a Rishon LeZion in Israel for hundreds and hundreds of years before the state of Israel. Once the state of Israel is founded, somehow the tide shifts and the Sephardic rabbis were no longer capable of and I say it with sarcasm, capable of taking on the task that they've been doing for hundreds of years before very, very well. And in the 1950s, you have a situation where all positions that were funded by the government were strictly reserved for Ashkenazi leaders, to the extent that Sephardic rabbis were not even allowed to sign documents without having to send the paperwork out and say, it doesn't matter that I'm the Chacham Bashi, I need you, the secretary, to please sign it for me. Chacham David Levy was instrumental in helping that shift. So though he wasn't a fighter, when he felt that there was injustice being done, he wasn't afraid to fight. He wasn't afraid to raise his voice. And ultimately, I believe that lost him his bid to being chief rabbi of the state of Israel. He was the Rishon LeZion of Tel Aviv, where the people loved him. He would go to the Sephardic, the Ashkenaz, the Yemenite, the Turkish. He would go everywhere. Every Bet Knesset, he would speak. The people loved him. And normally the next step from being the Rishon LeZion in Tel Aviv was being the Rishon LeZion, the chief rabbi of Israel. The problem was when they wanted to nominate him, he was part of the Mavdal party, right, the Mizrahi movement. And at this point, Chacham Ovadia Yosef said, hey, we need you on our team. Join Shas. If you join Shas, we're going to put you on the top. And for his reasons, Chacham David Levy said, I don't buy into it. I don't buy into the platform. I have my issues with what it stands for, what it is. I'm running on my ticket. And ultimately, he obviously lost. And it's tragic. It's very tragic when politics and affiliation versus character and assessment of, are these people capable for the job? Are they good for the job? Aren't taken into consideration. Ultimately, he does end up writing tremendous amounts of books. One of them being the Aseh Lecha Rav set, which is what we're going to be doing today. With many, many more. He ends up getting the multiple prizes, Pras Yisrael, Pras Rav Kook. He ends up getting from Bar Ilan an honorary PhD, so he gets the title of doctor. And you find here somebody who is so bright, so deep, and yet so in touch with the basic needs that society has. And I believe you'll see that in his teshuvah, the delicacy, the ability to understand the poor, the vulnerable, the downtrodden, the people who don't have a voice. Usually when people climb to the top, it's not just a neglect of those on the bottom, but it's on the backs of those who are on the bottom. And you have here a leader who understands the sensitivities needed. And I want to look at the teshuvah with you. If you look at page 6. So Rabbi Chaim David Halevy is posed with a question on the parts of Navi we just talked about regarding the Givonim. So here's somebody who writes a letter to him, and he's giving a response, and I want to take the response apart with you. Don't get scared by the Hebrew. I will read and translate whatever needs to be, and the rest we'll use Google Translate for. If you look at, again, page 6, source 1. So he gets a letter in 1984, and in this letter, the person writes to him about the story of the Givonim and the cruelty of having given over the 7 descendants of Shaul. And here's his questions. Hinni masher, I'm reading on the top. Hinni masher kabalat michtavcha, right? I've received your letter, B'yom Dalit Tammuz in Tavshin Memhei, 1984. B'tmiotcha, with your wonderment, b'kesher le'divrei rabotenu zal b'Yivamot. And he said, you've been wondering about the words of our rabbis in Yivamot, Mesechet Yivamot, Ayin Hey. Al ha-mesupar b'Navi, regarding the story in the Navi, where it says, Vayhi rav b'yemei David, and there was a famine in the days of David, Shalosh shanim, shana achar shana, v'yevakesh David et pnei Adonai. There were 3 years of famine. David asks why, and the response is because of the actions that Shaul took against the Givonim, and he massacred them. V'darshu rabotenu sham, and our rabbis over there are particular to point out, look at the bolded. El bet hadamim al asher himit et hagivonim. Why is there famine? Because of the actions that Shaul took against the Givonim by massacring them. V'yechan matzinu b'Shaul shehimit hagivonim. Hold on. Where do we see that Shaul massacred the Givonim? Ela, rather, HaChachamim tell us, mitoch sharag nov ir haKohanim, because he killed the city of the Kohanim, shayu maspikin lahem mayim umazon. And they were the Givonim sustained them through giving them food and water, and therefore now they didn't have food and water. Ma'ala lav hakatuv kilu haragam. We don't actually see a massacre of the Givonim, but by default, killing out the city of Nov Ir HaKohanim ultimately leads to the demise of the Givonim. Od misupar sham, right? Even more over there it says, Shelefi bakashat haGivonim, by request of the Givonim, nimseru lahem shiva mibnei Shaul, 7 of Shaul's descendants were given to them, whom 2, and they were killed, v'ku ba'al Adonai, v'kach itpaisu. They were given to them, they were hung, and that's how the Givonim were appeased. V'al zeh sha'alu rabotenu, and about this our rabbis ask, v'achtiv, doesn't it say, v'lo yamutu avot abanim, that parents shouldn't die because of the sins of their children, and children shouldn't bear responsibility for the actions of their parents? Look at the bold. V'tiretz Rabbi Yochanan, and if you look at source 2, it's an exact quote from the Talmud Bavli. V'tiretz Rabbi Yochanan responds, Mutav שתיעקר אות אחת מן התורה. It's better that one word, one verse from the Torah should be destroyed. ואל יתחלל שם שמיים בפרהסיה. But there should not be a desecration of the name of Hashem in public. Right? Your question of, well, why are the children paying? Doesn't the Torah say the children shouldn't pay for the actions of their father? Rabbi Yochanan says, you know what? Let's erase that verse so that there shouldn't be a chilul Hashem. If that doesn't bother you, it should. Why? Uperush Rashi, and Rashi adds over here, what's going to happen? The nations of the world are going to look at the Jewish people and say, you want to know how they treat their converts? You want to know how they treat the people who are not one of them? Just look. You want to see how they treat the people who aren't allowed to be citizens in their country? You want to see how they treat the people who are not part of their insular circle? Look at the Givonim. They had no problem not just letting Shaul dispose of them, but then doing nothing to make sure that they were compensated. Rabbi Yochanan says it's better the verse should be taken out of they shouldn't pay for the actions of their parents, and they should. So there shouldn't be a chilul Hashem. He says, V'tamata, and now you have 4 questions. Look at paragraph 2. V'tamata, v'chizu darka shel Torah shebekol derachenu ma'asenu yu al pi tzav shel ma yomuru hagoyim. So your first question is, I don't understand. What is this idea of, well, what are the non-Jews going to say? Is everything that I do I have to think, well, what are the neighbors going to say? Right. That's a ridiculous way to live. If my actions are correct, they're correct. If they're incorrect, they're incorrect. What is this? Well, what are the non-Jews going to say? So that's question number 1. Question 2 is, Hasvara, the bolded, Hasvara shel goyim hi rechoka miniyam. The logic of the goyim doesn't make sense. Hagoyim yomru sheshaul. They're going to say, oh, hold on. Shaul killed, this was an internal affair. Shaul killed the Kohanim. The Kohanim died, so the Givonim don't have jobs. So the Givonim died, so it means Shaul killed them? Come on, that's really convoluted. It's connecting A plus B plus apples. Third, al retzach nov ir hakohanim en tfiat nekem. We don't see that there's any justice or any complaint even on how did you kill the whole city of Kohanim? Where's the appeasement for that? Where's the retaliation on that end? We're only worried about the Givonim. Why are we not having a conversation about Nov, the city of Kohanim? And the 4th question is, uvechlal, and in general, where do we find anywhere written that they were contracted to never lose their jobs? They were not tenured into being wood choppers and water carriers. We don't find that when Yoshua says, I promise you that we're gonna sustain you, it means forever. I will forever make sure you have a job. No matter how many times you lose it, keep coming back to the welfare office, file unemployment, file disability. Who said? Meaning, how many times can you be a repeated offender? Who said that this was an eternal contract of making sure that they get taken care of? So those are the 4 questions posed. I want to read to you. If you look at the bottom of page 6, still on the right column. So after the bolded, right? We don't find anywhere that they've been promised not to be let go. No one promised that, your job folds, company's over. Sorry. After the ... He says, you've also added in your letter to me, I understand you have tremendous pain from this story, and you've added some words, and he's critiquing him in the most gentle fashion. He said, V'shachachta, you've added some really harsh words against the Chachamim. V'shachachta l'rega, you momentarily forgot, Sha'ata osek b'divrei rabotenu hakadoshim, that the words that you're trying to figure out the understanding, the meaning, these are words of our Chachamim. It's not just you read a poem somewhere and it didn't make sense. You had an article you didn't like. These are the words of the Chachamim. Hakidoshim shekol divreim kigachalesh. The words are like burning coals. V'aleim amar harambam. And the Rambam says, if you look down at source 5, what does the Rambam say? So in his Hakdama leperek chelek, the Rambam, in his no nonsense, talks about 3 categories of people who approach learning Agadah. The first 2 categories he speaks very disparagingly of. One category is a category of idiots who believe everything. One category is of idiots who don't believe anything. And then he has a 3rd category. And he says, I can't call the 3rd category because there are so few people in there. It's like me telling you the sun is a category or the moon is a category. It's not a category. There's just one of it. So he talks about this 3rd section. Look at source 5. If you're from this third group, when you'll read the words of the Chachamim, and you bump into something that in your mind makes no sense, it just doesn't fit. Tamod. Okay, stop a minute. V'titbonen. Now notice he doesn't say and just accept and believe because emunas chachamim. He says stop and think about it. Contemplate. V'titbonen bo. V'dashu chida u'mashal. It's a riddle. It's an allegory. There's something hidden here in the text that needs to be extracted. V'tishkav hashok alev v'tirud harayon b'chovaro u'v'sve'arato. Let it overwhelm you, this feeling of I don't understand, right? It's sitting on me, it's weighing on my heart. I'm deeply involved in thinking about what is this riddle. Try to find the logical explanation. And something that is true, it's just, it's not something that makes no sense. Like it says, למצוא דברי חפץ וכתוב Yosher divrei emet v'az tistaker b'sivrei zeh. And he says, you want to know how to learn divrei chachamim? When you bump into something that doesn't make sense, don't just accept it. That's stupid. But you don't either need to reject it. Sit with it. Sit with it and try to understand. Try to read the depth into it. Approach it from a place of weighing it, of koved rosh. If there's something that doesn't make sense, look for the logic, look for the understanding, and keep probing until you find it. And that is Rabbi Chaim David Levy's summary of his letter. He says, but now I want to respond to you. And if you look back, okay, so we're on page 6, back up to Rabbi Chaim David Levy, it's right on top of source 2. He says, the way you generally want to approach anything difficult from Chachamim is stop, think about it, take the time to invest and research it. He said, but happens to be this topic, Vilu Besugya Didan, this one that you're talking about, the city of Ir Nova Kohanim, Hadvarim Burim, it happens to be very, very clear. There's nothing hidden over here. Burim v'chochechim v'yesharim kashen nevar. He said, this happens not to be one of those places where the understanding is very, very convoluted. Let me help you understand how simple and straight and honest and just the story is. And I want to walk you through his teshuvah. Look at page 7. If you look at source 6, Rabbi Chaim David Levy divides his answer into 2 parts. So we're going to do part 1, part 2, and hopefully the sikum. Chovat memshal beparnasat ezrachav. He talks about the moral, ethical, practical obligation of a government to take care of the welfare of its citizens, to care for those who have less, to care for those who can't, deserving, undeserving, everybody. Let's look at this. I'm reading from the top of page 7, Kimamar. Okay. Kimamar Musgar Nagdim. So he says the first thing, as an aside, to answer your question of Shaul only killed the city of Nov Ir HaKohanim, why are the Givonim so angry? He says if you read the Pshat, and I highly recommend you do that. Harav Peretz, our rabbi, always tells us the truth lies in the truth of the sentence. What it says, that's what it meant, right? If you look into the Navi, Shaul harag mamash rabbi mea Givonim. Shaul actually did go ahead and massacre the Givonim. Vet Yitram giresh v'chulo in b'dvarim. If you look into the notes of Rabbi Sadia Gaon on this conversation, he says very simply, Shaul killed Givonim. The Nov Ir Kohanim were decimated, they lost their jobs, and that's why the Givonim were angry. Simply, Shaul killed Givonim, and that's why they're angry. He says, okay, but let's put that answer aside. Kamul, if you look at paragraph 2, L'divrei rabotenu b'vavli yevamot. He says, you want to understand the story? Look at the bold. Sheba'arigat kohanei Adonai b'Nov. When Shaul went ahead and killed the Kohanim of the city of Nov, Ibdu hagivonim matelachmam. They lost the source of livelihood. By killing the city of Kohanim, the Givonim are now all unemployed. You have to understand the Givonim, they're not naturalized citizens. They don't have the opportunities that others have. For example, they couldn't own pieces of land. They were strictly at the mercy of the Jewish people. And by killing the city of Kohanim, they were stripped of any ability to live in the land of Israel. They're not full-fledged citizens. They don't have the rights and protection of full-fledged citizens, and therefore, left without unemployment, they're really left to die. They had no ability to work the land. Their entire ability to sustain themselves, it wasn't, oh, so now I lost my job and I can't go to Hawaii during midwinter break. It's, I don't have a job, so tomorrow I don't have what to eat, so the next day they drop dead. Look at paragraph 2. And that's when we say, Yoshua, you promised lachayotam, to sustain them. Chovato shel kol, look at the bold. Kikach chovato shel kol memshal. Every single nation, anybody who is part of the government, anybody who has jurisdiction over other people, chovato shel kol memshal lidog, to be concerned, to worry, to take care, lekiyum kol ezrachav. You see the word kol? Every single citizen, whether they're an immigrant, whether they're there legally, illegally, they find themselves in your property, they find themselves under your jurisdiction, they follow your laws, so then you, the government, have a responsibility towards them to make sure that they have the ability to sustain themselves. Ben she'em toshvim, ben she'em gerim, whether they're citizens, whether they're foreigners, the kol sheken, and even more so, ele shenishbu lahem, they were promised, givonim, you will be protected. You are protected members of our society. We will care for you. So what was his obligation? Chayav haya lidog. It was his obligation to care. V'limtzo lehem parnasa chilufit. You killed the city of Ir Nova Kohanim. That's your account. It's an internal affair. Fine. But what are you going to do now about all the mass unemployment? Who's going to take care of that? It's okay for you to shut down one operation, but what are you now going to do with all those because of your decisions that are out of jobs? Because of you have no housing. Because of you have no ability to sustain themselves. Rabbi Chaim David Levy says, I don't know if in early governments this is what they used to do. He said, I'm not sure, right? I haven't done enough research on early governments, but I could tell you, I'm on the second to last paragraph from the bottom of the page on the right side. He says, Shelegabe givonim hayta kamur chovat shivua. He said, I can't tell you about earlier governments that were, at the same time period that we're talking about in Navi, but I could tell you that they were promised to be protected and they weren't. And then he goes on to a little bit of a tangent that I will actually speak about in my next class, but I'm still going to cover it because it's so important. He says, Zot va'od, this and more. Ba'am Yisrael, nagu tamid lid'og l'aniyim. The Jewish nation, part of our DNA is we are rachmanim, baishanim, gomlei chasadim. Every single Jewish community across the board will take care of their poor. And if you look at sources 8, 9, and 10, you will see the practical halachot of the Rambam, as well as Maran Rav Cairo and the Rama, regarding the halachot of tzedakah. He says there's no city, there's no Jewish community. And if you look at the bottom of page 7, it's known, meaning this is recorded, this is known, this is obvious. Ki mitzvat haTorah, lid'og, this is one of the obligations of the Torah, lid'og leparnasat haskukim, that we have a primary obligation to look out for the needs of those who need. V'kayom chova zot haya pshuta b'kol medina mitkademet. Today already, we live in a world where thankfully, in most first world countries, that is an obvious fact, that those who are in need must be absorbed into those who have, and have to be the responsibility of not just the government, the individuals, the communities. He says, and today we live in a world where at least the people who are not employed, for whatever reason, whether it's because of disability, inability to find work, they have some kind of fund that they could tap into so that they don't go broke and starve to death. Now look at the last, uvazeh, he said, and with this, chet Shaul legivonim, shegaram lehem mitat ra'av. He said the fact that Shaul killed the city of Kohanim and neglected to take care of the after effects. neglected to take care of the huge now population of unemployed, ultimately they die. They die of hunger. And the Givonim, they know, dying of, it says, Tov mechal lechel mechal lerav. It's better to die war, so it's a quick, one and done and it's over. Over here, they're having this painful death of every single day, starving to death. And that sin of Shaul HaMelech not being able to provide an alternative source of employment, that's the first huge error that Shaul HaMelech makes towards the Givonim, whether he massacres them proper or whether it's an indirect. Let's look at page 8. I want to teach you something else. Not just Shaul's inability to take care of the unintended consequences. Right? It's like dominoes. You push one on this side, but the 10th one is going to fall on the other side. His obligation was, you're going to take care of internal affairs with no Kohanim, so then make sure that the consequences of all those around are properly taken care of. He says, but let's add to that. Look at source 11. V'od, I'm reading from the top. V'od zot nitan lelmod midivreihem. Another lesson to learn. Hagivonim hufkeru lemitad rav. Right? Ultimately, they're left just to die. Right? It's not, I have a milk that's expired, so maybe I could use it. It's people are starving to death. Right? Are we going to make it to tomorrow? Are we not going to make it to tomorrow? And I think sometimes that's a hard concept to wrap your head around when, you go into a coffee shop, at least in the United States, there are 50 different choices. You can't just say, hey, I want a cup of coffee. It's, do you want it with cream, without cream, with this sugar? We live in a world of a tremendous amount of abundance that it's sometimes difficult to wrap our head around that literally just over a couple of borders, there are people who are starving to death. I know that where we live, 30 minutes down, you are in a different country, but you're also in a different world. There are people who are 3 and 4 and 5 sitting on the streets with dirty faces, begging for food. Right? That we don't live in a world where poverty is gone. To the contrary, I once read a fascinating article where they pay farmers in the United States to destroy crops, thousands and thousands of pounds of crops, because they have to keep the economic level in balance. And you wonder to yourself, there are people who are starving to death. Is there no way for us to take the resources and somehow get it over instead of just telling, you have a farm full of potatoes, just burn them all down? Right? These are contemporary issues that are not gone. The second problem, V'od, hagivonim hufkeru lemitad rav, right? So they're being left to famine. She'en anu yodim et mamdia vet hikefa ekev cheto shel Shaul. Okay, so we know that Shaul HaMelech, as the king, as the head of the government, he utterly neglected his responsibility. What about the people, though? V'kol am Yisrael ro'im. So here the entire Jewish nation knows what happened to the city of Kohanim. They now can see the plight of the Givonim. They see them dying, every day dropping like flies. V'yodim al kol al kach, v'ish eno moche. And what is the response from the bystanders? Yeah, the same as yours. Nothing. Silence. There is no response. You understand? There are people who are dropping like flies, dying in front of your house, and you do nothing. You continue going to work. Let's look at what happens. There's a famous case known as the Kitty Genovese case. Are any of you familiar with Kitty Genovese? Okay, I think because Oad's from New York, you may know a little bit more on this case. Who is Kitty Genovese, Oad?
I think she was a lady that got murdered, but no one stopped. There was people standing by and no one stopped them.
Yeah. Kitty Genovese was a 28-year-old in 1964, lived in Kew Gardens, which is in Queens, New York. She was a bartender coming home at 2 o'clock in the morning. All alone, gets out of her car, parks her car, is walking to her apartment building. Somebody comes from behind and brutally attacks her. And she starts screaming. So he runs away. He comes back about 10, 15 minutes later and rapes her and then murders her. The next morning, the cops come and find her dead, bleeding out. And they start asking the neighbors, And one neighbor says, oh yeah, actually I did hear. I heard somebody scream. Somebody says, I thought of calling the police. I wanted to call the police. The New York Times eventually wrote there were 38 people who heard her and didn't respond. They later on retracted it and said it wasn't 38, but a significant number of people, when interviewed, said, of course, we heard somebody screaming. But we assumed somebody else was going to take care of it, because if we heard it on the third floor, probably somebody on the first floor was going to call the police. And ultimately, she dies because nobody cared enough to pick up the phone. I'm not saying go out and confront the attacker, to simply pick up the phone and call 911, call the police station. You have, unfortunately, a similar story, much more gruesome, that happens in England in 1993. Tell me about James Bulger, or Bulger. Anybody familiar with that case? Okay. Yes?
Of course.
Yeah, tell.
He was killed by his classmates. No, he was a little boy, but he was tortured. I just can't remember if it was classmates or grown men. I think it was grown men.
So you're correct about him being...
Children.
It was two 10-year-olds.
Yeah.
So this was one of the most horrific cases. I don't recommend you read it before going to bed like I did, because it will give you nightmares. James was a 2-year-old who had been going shopping with his mom. She was at a butcher shop and let go of his hand momentarily because she went to get something. She was paying. 2 10-year-olds dragged him away, and I cannot give you the details of the murder because they are so gruesome. Murdered him, mutilated his body in broad daylight. And when they got the footage and started interviewing people said, yeah, of course, we actually passed him on the street. We saw the 2-year-old crying. We saw the 2 10-year-olds going to the train tracks. We saw them pulling out paint. We saw things, and we said nothing. You understand? A 2-year-old who was in an open marketplace where there are hundreds of people who saw him, who witnessed something, and what did they do? They did nothing. Nothing.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yeah, of course.
So all these instances of Gentiles in other lands who are poverty-stricken, of this woman who was killed, of this little boy who was killed, are you suggesting that it's our Jewish duty to take care of the Gentile?
That's a really good question. It's not me just suggesting, but our Torah actually obligates us to take care of all human beings.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
But
absolutely. I believe it was Chacham Uziel, if I'm not mistaken, who said when he talks about he's talking to the Arabs and the Jews on a Shabbat where they come out in conflict. The Arabs are throwing stones, and he calls them to the battlefield. And he says, "Come. Before you're going to be Arabs and before you're going to be Jews, we're all going to be the sons of Bnei Avraham Avinu. Let it be Shabbat. Let's settle things civilly." And you see this specifically in the Chachmei Sfarad. Okay, this understanding that the word goyim, which literally means nations, non-Jews are an essential part of the world, as are Jews. And the relationship and the need for us to care for them is very clear, at least from Chachmei Sfarad. So yes, now let me hold for a second. I want to share one more case, which is in 2017 in Florida. There were 3 teenagers who were at some kind of a reservoir, and they witnessed somebody who was somewhat disabled. So I don't know if it was intellectually disabled, physically disabled, walk into this reservoir and start drowning. So you see, in these 2 cases, cell phones weren't around yet. We didn't have smartphones, right? What these teenagers do is they see him drowning and he starts screaming to them, "Help me. I cannot swim." What do these kids do? They're not kids, they're 16, 17-year-olds. What do? They start taking out their smartphone and filming him. It used to be you had to find criminals. Today, the criminals are stupid enough. They just take videos of themselves and put them on social media, right? So you know where to find them. So they start videoing themselves, mocking him, taunting him, and he's begging them for help. One of them even says, "Hey, bro, do you have the guts to see somebody die?" And he just dies. And you look at this where, okay, so the person committing the atrocity is one thing. What about the obligation of all the people around? And I want to look at source. Here, look at page 8. Still the top, the second bolded. It's important for us to highlight שכל מידותיו של הקדוש ברוך הוא מידה כנגד מידה. Hashem does מידה כנגד מידה. החטא כלפי הגבעונים, right? Meaning the justification of why 3 years of famine. Because you caused the Givonim to die through famine. So the Jewish people, you'll experience a little bit of what it feels like to be sitting with your mouth parched, with your stomach growling because you have no idea where the next day's food is going to come from. Now look at the last paragraph on this page. Now we know ultimately the Givonim prove themselves to be equally unworthy. Meaning when David HaMelech comes and says, I want to appease you, what is the appeasement the Givonim are looking for? They're not looking for appeasement, they're looking for revenge, right? And their revenge, the cruelty of then taking the children, hanging them, sort of, it seals the deal. And David HaMelech, Moshe had already said they won't be able to join the people. David HaMelech says, no, you're not joining Am Yisrael. If you look at this sugya here, I'm reading on page 8, the second paragraph. במעשה אכזרי זה כשלעצמו, meaning this heinous act of killing the 7 children in retaliation, על פי בקשת הגבעונים, by request of the גבעונים, נתקדש שם שמיים בין האומות. As gruesome as it was, the chilul Hashem, the desecration of the name of Hashem, was turned. And this turned into a moment. Why of a kiddush Hashem? Look at, it says bisugya, look at 13. אמר רבי יוחנן, רבי יוחנן said, משום רבי שמעון בן יהוצדק, מוטב שתיעקר אות אחת מן התורה. It's better that we should erase one verse, one word from the Torah, ויתקדש שם שמיים בפרהסיה, so that the name of Hashem should be glorified in public. And Margaret, this is going back to exactly what you talked about. שהיו עוברים ושבים, so that the passerbyers who saw these bodies would say, מה טיבן של אלו? What happened here? Why are these 7 people hanging out here? And what did they say? You know who these people are? They're from the aristocracy of the Jewish people. B'nei melachim hem. U'ma osu. What did they do to deserve to be hung? Oh, you want to know what they did? Pashtu yedeim b'gerim. Oh, they hurt the converts. They hurt the foreigners. You want to know a system that's not corrupt? Even the king's sons, when they will be corrupt, when they will be hurtful, when they will not take care of the vulnerable, they will be meted out punishment. Just because you're up here doesn't mean you can neglect what's down here. Pashtu yedeim b'gerim gurim, amru, en lecha uma. And when the people saw this, they said, wow, en lecha uma sheroya lidabek ba. There is no nation like the Jewish people who are willing to take their own people and put them on the pulpit to say, hey, you did something wrong. You did something wrong. It's true he's a foreigner. It's true they're an immigrant. It's true that this is somebody who's not even part of our society, but you wronged them. And if you wrong them, you're not getting a free pass. It's not a system of protect you. If you're one of us, so you can do whatever you want, but if you're not one of us, we can hurt you as much as possible. And when the nations of the world saw that, they said, could you imagine if they treat the foreigner with so much respect? Imagine what it's like to join the Jewish people, because they care about theirs. They care about the vulnerable. They're not corrupt, right? They don't hurt other individuals. They make sure the poor, the needy, their voices aren't silenced. They make sure people don't feel rejected from their society because of the color of their skin. They don't reject people because they only eat certain kinds of foods and other people don't. They don't reject people because of the way they dress or the things that they speak about or the interests they have. Right? That's the kind of Jewish people David HaMelech is steering to. A society of justice, a society that doesn't throw people under the bus because they can, all in the name of religion. Because if I wear a certain kind of clothes and I look a certain way and I act a certain way, so then I could disparage you because you're less. You're less deserving of having a voice in my court. You're less deserving of having equal opportunities I have because you chose to be different. You're part of the undeserving people. You're part of the society that I have no obligation to care for because you're not one of us. If you would look like us and act like us and talk like us and think like us and subscribe to my philosophy, maybe I'll take care of you. But if you step out of line, why in the world would I care about you? Why in the world? Because 3 years of famine, of Jewish deaths, was not enough to repay for the sin against the Givonim, whether directly or indirectly killed them. I want to look if do we have 5 more minutes? Ohad, where are you? Yep, okay. If we look at page 9, Rabbi Chaim David Levy sums up the tshuva. He says, and look at source 14 on the top. It says, and this is a little bit of a tangent. He says, I want to help you understand why there's no retaliation for Shaul killing the city of Nov, Ir HaKohanim. He says, Shavon Hari, look at the bolded. Shavon Harigat Nov, because the killing of the city of the Nov, Nimchal lo bezeh, shenitbayesh b'maaseh avera zeh. He says, Shaul HaMelech has tremendous amount of shame for killing out the city of Nov. And he explains how we know that when Shaul HaMelech goes to the sorcerer to bring up Shmuel Hanavi, and he doesn't tell him anything about the story, we see extreme regret and shame. He said, don't underestimate the power of not just teshuvah, but living with this tremendous shame. And he brings some sources from the Gemara, which talk about how shame, right? Hamalbim pnei chavero berabim, kilu shofer damim. It's literally like murder. When people feel that intrinsic, I don't deserve to exist. I am no longer part of the human club. That shame, he said, don't underestimate it. And that teshuvah of Shaul was enough. Now, not only that, he says, look at the next bold. Ki abusha hi inyan kasha biyoter. This degradation, the shame, is something very chamor. V'govela im shvichat damim. It's tantamount to murder. V'kdevrei rabotenu. And if you look at again source 16, you'll see it actually in the words of the Gemara. He says, I want to add to that in addition. If you look at it from Shaul's perspective, Shaul is going through a tremendously difficult emotional turmoil. If you look at source 18, you'll see all the love, the hate, the fear, the paranoia towards David HaMelech. I got in trouble for using the word paranoia in one of my other classes. They said, how could you talk about Shaul HaMelech like that? I don't know. Last I checked, Hashem did not give us all these books to put on shelves in museums with curators to make sure that once a year we open it and we say, V'zot HaTorah. I believe the Torah is a Torat Chaim, and we're meant to learn with the greatest kavod, with the greatest respect. The Navi tells us Shaul HaMelech is going through a tremendously difficult emotional time with his highs and his lows. And he sees David HaMelech, not just, he sees him as a mored. He sees him as ultimately somebody committing treason. And the city, by default, of Kohanim who house them are now treasonous. And his errant, obviously, it's wrong, but in his judgment, we know that the punishment for treason is, according to Jewish law, what is the punishment for treason? Capital punishment. So in his perspective, he did nothing wrong by killing the city of Kohanim, because they are siding with the treasonous traitor, and therefore they, according to the law, deserve to be killed out. Look at the last paragraph before number 15. So actually 2 paragraphs over 15. ואם די בזה מן הראוי לדון את שאול, okay, כי היה נתון באותו זמן במצב נפשי קשה מאוד. He said he was going through a really difficult past. ומשום כך, look at the second bold, ומשום כך נמחול לו עוון זה. He was forgiven for this sin. אבל עוון הגבעונים, but we understand why you killed the city of Nov Ir HaKohanim. In his perspective, it was justified according to the judgment of the law. But the Givonim, what in the world did the Givonim deserve to be decimated? What in the world did the Givonim do to deserve to be neglected so that they should die of famine? I want to sum it up for you. You're looking here at a Teshuvah, where Chacham David Levy is talking about an underprivileged group, a group that only made problems for the Jewish people. The Givonim from the onset, they join us with trickery. They join us in a way that is totally underhanded through lies. And yet our obligation to them, once they are part of our nation, is like any other citizen in the world. How could it be that there's a government that doesn't care for the people's basic needs? How could it be that you could go to sleep at night knowing that there are people in the street who tomorrow morning will be dead because nobody cared about them? Last week I read a story. There was a 56-year-old who was sleeping in a dumpster here in the United States. Why was he sleeping in a dumpster? Because he's lazy, because he's bad, because he's made poor choices. No. I don't know what his life story is. All I could tell you is the next morning when the garbage truck came to pick up the dumpster, they didn't realize there was somebody in there. And they crushed him to death. I'm not blaming the truck driver. You understand? The truck driver was doing his job. My question is, what about our job? What about us? What is our obligation when we look at society? What is our obligation when we build a society? And I have to say, I'm looking at a teshuvah where Rabbi Chaim David Levy, he says, we have answers. We have answers to societal problems. You know why we have answers? Because this, and I speak nicely, the Sephardic Chachamim and the Sephardic Jews in general have always maintained autonomous societies. So it didn't matter where we traveled, we always ran our own society. And therefore the social problems that came up have already been dealt with, right? This teshuvah, I read it, I was like, wow, it's so revolutionary. And then I read the Abarbanel, right? Don Yitzhak Abarbanel from Spain, and he says the exact same thing. I said, wow, that's so revolutionary. And then you realize that our Chachamim have never stopped dealing with social issues. Because as a Jewish people, as an autonomous Jewish people, that is our obligation. You have to obviously ask yourself the question, why when 1948 we come to build a Jewish state, we somehow willfully bury all the rabbis who've had answers up until now that have worked, and kind of like blind men are groping in the dark trying to reinvent a wheel that has already been invented, right? The teshuvot of, well, how do we deal with the poor? How do we deal with people who don't want to be employed? How do we deal with women who can't get their get? How do we deal with all these issues? How do we deal with the oppressed? How do we deal with people who don't feel like they have a place in our society? These are issues that are not new. The context will always change, right? It's always going to be something different. The story's always different. The storyline of we are here as people. And I believe that before we are Jews, we are human beings, all playing a different role. And our Chachamim have dealt with these issues. And now really it's up to us. It's up to us to say, you know what, whether I'm in the leadership and therefore I have an obligation to take care of the vulnerable, or whether I'm an individual and I'm a bystander, either way I'm obligated. Because there's nobody that can go to bed at night without thinking, well, I have a safe space. But what about the person on the street? What about the child? What about the orphan? And Bezrat Hashem, I believe that if we start thinking about the other, not just as, oh, I'm such a nice person because I care about people, but I am obligated, both on a national level and an individual level, I believe that together we can make an impact. Together we can change the tide of society so that when we go to sleep at night, we can rest assured that the societal issues that we face today don't need to be inherited for tomorrow.